War, women were not expected to work outside of the household and men were expected to do all the external jobs. During the Jacksonian period, it was especially emphasized that women should dedicate their energy to the home and domesticity. They could not have a stand in politics nor vote. However, many vocal women advocated for more women's rights and aimed for equality of the two sexes. A women's rights movement was sparked. The Civil War contributed the movement significantly. Since men were now too busy fighting in the war as soldiers, women now had to take on various roles. Some women became nurses on the battlefield, other women sewed garments for soldiers, and others worked in factories and even desk jobs. While women in both the Union and Confederacy both contributed in similar ways, they both had their differences. We are going to interview 3 different individual women, a nurse, a northern woman, and a southern woman to view the differences in each woman's contributions.
Before the war, women in the North were already working in a variety of industries, which included clothing and textiles. As the war progressed, they began to take on employment in different capacities, given that men had gone to fight and their roles needed to be filled. Women began to take on jobs in the fields and in civil service. As men entered the Union Army, women's proportion of the manufacturing workforce went from 1/4 to 1/3, according to the Library of Congress. Women began to take on more responsibilities and became comfortable with their independence. Women also took on jobs in urban communities. For example, in Washington, D.C., many women took desk jobs. That doesn't mean that all women supported the war effort, though. Families of the North began to lose patience. Working-class women began to join in on riots against the draft in northern cities such as Boston and New York in 1863. On the other side of that, women took it upon themselves to get directly involved in the Civil War as help was needed and appreciated. Northern women assisted the war effort from the home front by getting supplies to troops. They had more resources to draw upon than did their Southern counterparts.
One woman that organized such endeavors was Mary Livermore, an abolitionist and women's rights advocate from Massachusetts. Mary, what was the work that you did in relation to the Civil War?
I worked with the Chicago branch of the United States Sanitary Commission to raise money for soldiers and aid the Union's war efforts. I organized auxiliary societies, visited military posts and hospitals, and wrote for newspapers. I served as a spokesperson for the USSC, essentially. One of my biggest contributions was organizing the Great Northwestern Fair. It was an event in which we could auction and sell food, entertainment, and war mementos. The fair went on for 2 weeks with the aim of generating money for our troops.
And what came of the fair?
We ultimately raised $100,000 for the Union Army. It also inspired in events of the same nature, so much so that fair mania overtook the social circles of upper-class women. Examples of other fairs include the restaurant department of the Great Central Fair. This event was for the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware crowd. It encourages all donations. Another fair in Philadelphia was held to collect supplies for sick and wounded Civil War soldiers.
Alright, so what do you hope is the result of your work on the rights of women?
Then, for the end draws near. A few more years of persistent, faithful works, and the women of the United States will be recognized as legal equals of men.
Being able to organize fairs like this meant that women were venturing into the public sphere. Another common role for women in times of war was to serve as a vivandière. Vivandières were typically young women who were the wives or daughters of officers. They were armed, earned military awards, and even were captured by the enemy. They weren't soldiers and were not permitted to fight, but they could sometimes serve as field nurses. They would sew uniforms, cook, wash clothes, mend shoes, do whatever was needed to care for soldiers. Being a vivandière was seen as an acceptable role for a woman. For some women, however, it wasn't enough. They wanted a more active role. Some would even disguise themselves as men to fight on the battlefield, Frances Clayton being a prime example of this. She reportedly fought in 18 battles, including the battles of Shiloh and Stones River. Women also served as spies during this time. Take Elizabeth Van Lew, who organized a network of spies that had sources within even the Confederate White House. Of course, the most famous spy was Harriet Tubman, who served as a Union agent in South Carolina. From the home front to the battlefield, the role of women in the Civil War was critical. It caused a shift in the perception of women's roles and moved forward the women's rights campaign.
Similar to Mary Livermore, we will next be talking to Harriet Mott, another woman who resided in the North. However, what sets apart Mott to Livermore is the fact that Mott served the Union Army as a nurse during the part of the duration of the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, nursing was primarily seen as a man's job. It was not a woman's place to be in the medical field at the time, and women were not seen as capable enough to do so. Yet, this all had to change once the Union Army came face to face with the realization that they were extremely unprepared for the multitude of carnage they would soon have to come to face with. Harriet, how did you find yourself working as a nurse during the time of the Civil War?
As the war progressed, it became evidently clear that the Union was in need of dire medical help. So I applied to the nursing corps to fill in that gap left by a lack of male nurses. I applied to the nursing corps, and there were a few requirements like being between the ages of 35 and 50, having generally good health, and being able to serve a minimum of 3 months, just to list a few.
Now that we have established how you came to be a nurse for the North, let's delve into how that experience must have been like from your eyes. The Civil War remains the bloodiest war in American history, with the most American casualties. Did you feel as if you were prepared to be faced with so much carnage?
Absolutely not. I don't think anything could have prepared me for the amount of bloodshed and loss of human life I would see. On a daily basis, I was met with men facing gunshot wounds or dysentery. I was met with infections, tuberculosis, and measles. I even saw a few women pass out while on the job during my time as a nurse. The Civil War is infamously known as the bloodiest war in American history, since it resulted in the most American casualties. However, what most people don't consider is the fact that the Civil War didn't just consist of battle wounds and gunshots. Instead, a lot of the casualties consisted of disease. The Civil War is just as much of a war on disease than it was between the North and the South. People often overlook the important role played by female nurses and how they were able to step up during a crucial time period in history and save countless of lives. Prior to the Civil War, I had a little bit of experience tending to sick family members, and I even helped as a midwife with childbirths in my community. So I drew from those experiences as my time as a nurse, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw and experienced. I was pretty ill prepared and did not have the amount of professional medical training as I needed.
It must have been truly devastating to deal with such a volume of death and illness. As a female nurse, do you believe your gender set you apart or impacted your work as a nurse in any way? And how so?
Female nurses really took upon this domestic role when caring for their patients. Personally, I felt as if I took upon this role or duty of motherhood, and that I cared for my patients as a mother would care after their child. Female nurses really went above and beyond the set expectations and worked to build a strong emotional connection with their patients as well, and I truly believe that this helped them get better. I have distinct memories of female nurses and I reading to our patients and even praying with them, and these things were never really done by men. In the past, there was this notion that women were far too emotional or too frail and weak to work as nurses, yet our womanhood and our femininity really helped us excel in our job in a way that men hadn't before.
Did you face any challenges while being a nurse at this tumultuous time?
Every single day, I faced so much death and disease. I had to work long hours, which were not only physically exhausting, but mentally as well. I also remember Black nurses and immigrant nurses having to work through discrimination and having to take on more meticulous tasks than other female nurses.
Wow, it is truly beautiful to hear how your womanhood played a part in your duties as a nurse. As a final question, I would like to ask if you believe the Union's success could be attributed to the help of women.
I truly believe the women had a great positive impact on the Union Army with the help that we provided sick Union soldiers during the time of the Civil War. We helped soldiers heal both emotionally and mentally, and this is often overlooked. Many women like myself were not too familiar with the medical field, yet we were able to rise to the occasion when it truly mattered. Women helped fill in the gap left by lack of male nurses, and we were able to revolutionize women in the workforce. As important historical figure and former Civil War nurse Clara Burton has stated,
I may be compelled to face danger, but I never fear it. And while our soldiers can stand and fight, I can stand and feed and nurse them.
Byrne explains how although women could not fight in the war, they did their best to provide aid in any which way they could. Women were able to rise to the occasion and not only fulfill their duty, but use their womanhood and embrace it to excel at their duties. Female nurses during the time of the Civil War led to an increase of women working and more women playing a part in society from outside their homes. This led to fewer women wanting to live a domestic lifestyle and more women wanting to become an active member of society. Notable female nurses such as Clara Burton and Dorothea Dix went on to create important organizations such as the Red Cross and revolutionize the nursing industry forever. Female nurses at the time of the Civil War paved the way for future working women to come.
I suppose let's start at the beginning. As rumors of war spread in the beginning, how did you feel about it?
Well, there's nothing to say much about it. Everybody knew it was coming. It was only a matter of when, no matter what anyone said. The ladies and I, well, all we could do was hope and pray. But even then, I feared that would do no good.
Do you think anyone was surprised that anything like this happened?
Only a fool would believe that something like this could have been prevented. Well, there's nothing to say much about it. Everybody knew it was coming. It was only a matter of when, no matter what anyone said. The ladies and I, well, all we could do was hope and pray. But even then, I feared that would do no good.
Do you think anyone was surprised that anything like this happened?
Only a fool would believe that something like this could have been prevented. As I said, we all knew it was coming. I don't know much about it, but state after state kept leaving, and then we were at war. The men left, we stayed, and the most we heard were from the papers, until they came to us.
Yes, the war that split America. Tell me, were you ever involved with the war? What I mean by that is, do you feel that you ever contributed to it?
To be quite frank, all of us had too much on our plates. Well, with the house and the children, Anna's husband had slaves. But when he left, well, what was poor Anna to do? She had the kids, the house, her own family down in Georgia. She couldn't do too much when they started running.
Let's stop right there. What with the proclamation abolishing slavery and the war taking a turn to riddling the South of the practice of slavery, what exactly are your thoughts here?
We did all that we could. But with winters coming and the Confederate government that they made up in Virginia, we couldn't do too much. All of the women, including myself, wrote to the governors to send our men home. Lord above knows that they'd rather come home than fight.
Women all over the South wrote to their mayors, governors, and anyone they could reach, demanding their men back home.
If you don't take these Yankees away from Greensboro, we women will write for our husbands to come home and help us.
Nancy Mungan to the North Carolina governor. These threats were not unfounded. Soldiers were ready to leave the field and return home to their homes and families.
But it is not of ourselves that we would complain. It is our wives and little ones at home who are necessitors. Do something for them, and there will be less desertion, and men will go into battle with heartier goodwill.
North Carolina soldiers to their governor.
The Union employed their destructive strategies pretty early on, I would say, most likely cut resources off from the Confederacy, as well as any transportation networks that had been established. And because of this created even more problems, not just for the armies, but for local communities in those areas. The troops needed supplies, so they looked for the nearest source.
At the beginning, you talked about how you almost had no news about the war, not until they came to you. What exactly do you mean by that?
Pretty early on, I would say that the Union come and, start taking everything. We didn't have much to give, but that didn't matter to them. They took what they could and left us with barely anything. Mabel's house was absolutely ransacked, leaving the poor girl in tears. They took what they could, burned what they couldn't. And it wasn't just them. Armed soldiers came around and much earlier than them, taking the horses, the food, the clothes, anything they needed, we had to give.
You mentioned Mabel and Anna, your friends, and their struggles during this time. Could you describe what happened to the other women in communities like your own?
Well, you're gonna have to be more specific. What we did depended on what our husbands believed in. If you were a man in the war, you were helping out. If your man didn't care for it, well then neither did you.
Do Do you know anything about the women making an effort in the war? What kind of work did they do?
Well, if you had a man in the army, you usually followed him around and, if possible, took up some time as a nurse. I'm sure a friend of mine explained that a bit earlier. Anna knew a woman in Georgia, goes by Mary Jones, who had the whole fare for the war, raised thousands of dollars, and used up that money so that she and her other rich friends could make a couple hundred uniforms. If you couldn't afford to do that, someone often worked in the factories. Needlewomen, we called them. They basically sewed up uniforms and tents for the armies. Those ended up closing some time ago. If you were for the Union, you obviously didn't go around and flaunt it. It just wasn't the safest, and it was better to keep your mouth shut.
Well, this has been an interesting viewpoint to learn more about. Thank you.
Dear, the pleasure was all mine.
Women went from staying indoors and focusing on house-related activities to leaving their designated comfort zone to be head-on in the battlefield serving as nurses. The scope of women's duties expanded. Many raised fundraisers, became vocal rights activists, fought as soldiers, and working women gradually became more normalized as they were seen often working in factories. These roles of women did not only persist during the Civil War, it was also prominent during World War I. Here, too, they became nurses, worked both manufacturally and agriculturally, and could be seen on the battlefield. Women destroyed this gender norm that they had to rely on men. Now they had men rely on them when they were injured or in need of service. The contributions of women came from both sides of the war, but regardless of where they came from, they each found various tactics to support their region's armies.